So my oldest son, Chase, is what I call a tinkerer. Tinkerer is like the best word I can come up with it. When he was a kid, he would take a toy, and before he'd even play with it, he had to figure out how it worked right away. He'd take this toy, he'd get it, he would disassemble it to see how all the inner workings went, and then he'd reassemble it. And he'd do that over and over again before he'd even ever play with it. I mean, it was a fascinating thing. He'd done this since he was like 3 years old. I always said that he was going to either get into computers or cars when he was growing up. And the truth is, he's a grown man now, and he's into both. He is wired to be a tinkerer. His very favorite birthday present I ever got him was this tackle box of like little things. It was all the little things I found in his pockets and around the house, the things he collected so that he could continue taking apart things and then reconstructing them. This tackle box, I put in things like old remote controls, old cassette players. You remember little Walkmans? I threw those in there. And then a bunch of things that he could mess with them. Things like screws and rubber bands and batteries and balsa wood and twist ties and zip ties and electrical tape. One day he was upstairs in his room tinkering with his little tackle box, and he came downstairs and he was so excited because he had taken the turning part of a cassette tape mechanism. He had put it on a piece of balsa wood, then wired up some wheels made out of something else and a few other things. And then he wanted to get a new battery because he was sure that this little car was going to work. He put in this new battery, and all of a sudden, it was going to take its initial drive. He put it on the ground, and it went backwards. And he was like, oh my gosh, it works. And then he turned, he goes, but I can fix that. And so he went and reconfigured it so that he switched some wires so that it went forwards, this little car. He's the kind of guy who can take something apart and then put it all back again. Now, this is not me. This is not me. I am not that kind of person. This is really, really hard for me. A lot of times these days, I hear from people who are doing what they call deconstructing their faith. They're taking apart the faith that captivated them once when they were young. Maybe they were young or in their teens or their 20s, and their faith was on fire and it felt so good and so all-encompassing. But then as they lived into it longer, they're finding that some parts of this faith, some parts of this understanding, it just doesn't seem to work for them anymore. God all of a sudden is bigger and doesn't fit into this constructed box that they have put God into. God seems more graceful than guiltful. God seems more inclusive than exclusive. God seems bigger than God has ever seen before. And then they find that the box, that the shape of the theology, the piety, the doctrine that kept them comfortable when their faith was younger, it doesn't fit anymore. And they deconstruct in order to figure out what this new perspective on God might be. The problem is I think for so many of us, we have been taught or we've been modeled a faith that was reconstructed, a faith that we don't know how to put back together after we take it apart. Some of us are just not naturally a tinkerer. And once we pull it apart and we kind of dissect some of the pieces of it, we look at all the pieces on the floor and we become completely disillusioned with it. Sometimes we just quit and we walk away, or we throw our hands up and say, it can't be fixed. I'm just done with this whole faith thing. But here's the thing that I think is both beautiful and true. I believe that God wants us to deconstruct our faith. That this deconstruction is not actually a lack of faith, but it's a growing in faith. And I can prove this. Jesus tells this story in the 15th chapter of John about this vine. Jesus says this to his followers. He says, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, God prunes so that it will even become more fruitful. You're already clean because of the word that I have spoken to you. Remain in me, and I will also remain in you. Because no branch can bear fruit by itself, but I remain in the vine. Neither can you bear fruit unless you remain in me. And then Jesus continues. He says, I am the vine and you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, then you will bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. But if you do not remain in me, then you're like a branch that is thrown away and withers. Some branches are picked up and they're thrown into the fire and burn. But if you remain in me and my words remain in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you. This is to my Father's glory, that you will bear much fruit. You see, I think if looking at the story, sees that God, that Jesus is all for deconstruction. Jesus is all for pruning, is for looking at the parts of our faith that just don't work or serve us anymore, about taking those parts out and maybe throwing them into the fire if we need to, because they don't bear fruit. Taking apart that doctrine that just doesn't make sense to us anymore and saying, like, no, that's not part of it, but it's the parts that are good that'll continue to grow and be reconstructed to new growth and new understanding about how big our God really, really is. And I want to encourage you today that if you feel like your faith is sort of falling apart, if you feel like it's being deconstructed and you feel like it's being pruned, I want to encourage you, keep tinkering, keep going, because we have a God who's so not afraid of your questions, your wrestlings, your longings, your struggle, your doubts. Instead, God invites and welcomes them and wants to do something new with them. So that's how you put your faith together.